The wheel turns again, though no one announces it. In the quiet hours before markets open, before the clatter of trading floors and the daily litany of headlines, something fundamental shifts beneath the surface of global finance. Empires rise and fall with grand proclamations, banners raised, armies marching. But the demise of a reserve currency never comes with fanfare. It begins in the unnoticed creases of everyday life, in the increasing cost of a loaf of bread, in the subtle unraveling of long-trusted contracts, in the retreat of capital toward perceived safety. History shows this pattern not as theory, but as recurring fact. Centuries ago, the Mediterranean world revolved around a currency so dominant that foreign states hoarded it like treasure, cities priced goods in its terms, armies were paid with it, and distant provinces counted their taxes in its units. For 2.5 centuries, it was the unquestioned bedrock of regional exchange. Traders, merchants, and common folk alike took its value for granted. Yet, when that bedrock began to crack, it did so not with a thunderclap, but with a series of soft, nearly invisible tremors. Debt burgeoned beyond sustainable levels. Confidence eroded in distant capitals long before it registered at far-flung ports. By the time the decline was acknowledged in the Imperial Senate, it had already carved deep fissures through the economic core of that world. Later, in the high seas of the early modern era, a new monetary order emerged. Silver from the New World poured into Europe, and one maritime power's currency became the spine of global trade. For decades, it seemed immutable. Wars were fought under its standard, finance expanded around it. Yet beneath the shimmer of prosperity, structural imbalances grew. Credit outpaced production, speculation outpaced savings, and the incentives that once aligned sovereign interest with economic discipline slowly diverged. As with all such systems, the unraveling began not at the center, but at the margins, unnoticed until it was undeniable. Patterns repeat because human systems are driven by recurring incentives: the promise of wealth, the weight of obligations, the urge to defer hard choices. When a dominant monetary system begins its terminal descent, the first casualties are rarely political. No capital is sacked. No declaration is made. Instead, faith, the quiet confidence of millions, ebbs imperceptibly. And once faith is lost, no ledger, no reserve, and no treasury can restore it. We are in the late chapter of one such arc now, unwinding in plain sight without a ceremonial ending. And as the pattern dictates, the most unsettling truth isn't that change is coming. It is that it has already begun. The texture of systemic collapse is not dramatic. It is not a series of explosions or bloodless coups. It is a progression, subtle at first, like rust creeping through iron. Empires do not collapse in a day. They rot from within over decades, sometimes centuries, before the final toll is taken. What we observe in the historical record is a sequence of overlapping stages, each one eroding the foundations of what seemed once unshakable. To recognize a collapse in motion, one must understand these stages not as isolated events, but as a cascade of structural shifts. The first stage emerges during expansion. A system accumulates extraordinary influence, often due to a strategic advantage, whether in geography, technology, or institutional frameworks. In this phase, abundance masks future constraints. Confidence in the system's superiority grows. At its peak, expansion feeds on its own reputation, and critics are dismissed as ignorant or pessimistic. The second stage begins when external pressures, competition, war, demographic shifts, force a system to stretch beyond its productive means. The cost of maintaining dominance grows, but the mechanisms to replenish that capacity do not. Stage 3 is marked by financial distortion. Here, credit becomes a tool of illusion. Instead of financing new productive capacity, debt is piled upon existing structures to sustain consumption and apparent growth. The prices of assets inflate. Real productivity falters relative to the claims placed upon it. The leaders of the system grow increasingly reliant on leverage to prop up expectations of continuity. This is the point at which warning signs are most visible, but also most ignored. For those invested in the status quo, and that includes almost everyone with a stake in the system, hope delays action. The fourth stage, social strain, follows. Inequality intensifies. The gains of earlier eras become concentrated among a narrowing class. For the many, wages stagnate while the cost of living climbs. Governments, in turn, resort to social spending to mollify growing discontent, further straining financial resources. Public trust begins to fray, not necessarily in dramatic ruptures, but in thousands of daily compromises. Promises unfulfilled, commitments deferred. Stage 5 is institutional compromise. Regulatory frameworks weaken. Rules that once underpinned stability are bent, or outright discarded, to mask deeper rot. Standards of fiscal and monetary discipline slip. The core institutions that once commanded broad respect and compliance now struggle to enforce basic norms. At this point, confidence weakens further, not just among elites, but within the broader populace. In the sixth stage, decline accelerates. Market signals become erratic. Capital flees toward perceived safe havens. Attempts to stimulate growth through monetary expansion or fiscal interventions yield diminishing returns. The system's ability to adapt is undermined by the very tools that were meant to sustain it. What was once incremental deterioration now shifts toward irreversibility. The final stage is the reconfiguration of order. This is not a sudden collapse like a building imploding, but a systemic transformation where the old framework no longer serves as the foundation of economic reality. New structures emerge, not necessarily better or worse, but different. Throughout history, every dominant order has passed through these stages, not by random chance, but because the incentives that built them also inevitably unravel them. And when this progression reaches its late phases, recognition often comes too late to change the outcome, because collapse in its own way is uneventful until it is complete. Centuries before, there was a global economy. There was a single currency that dominated the known world, not because of decree, but because everyone chose to use it. Silver drachma, stamped in the mints of a Mediterranean empire, became the common measure of value from bustling Anatolian markets to caravan stations on dusty Silk Road outposts. Its weight was trusted, its purity assumed. Kings and merchants alike priced goods in its terms, settled contracts with its weight, and stored it in their vaults as a proxy for trust itself. At the height of its influence, it was not merely money, it was confidence made tangible. The empire that issued this coin was not born at the apex of power. It began as one among many city-states, hardened by conflict and unified through strategic alliances. What set it apart was not sheer force, but a capacity to create order and predictability in a tumultuous world. Roads were built, lawgivers codified rules, and disputes were settled through mechanisms that transcended local custom. Trade flourished because distant partners could anticipate terms. From wine to wool to slaves, goods moved with increasing frequency and volume, and all were priced in the familiar sheen of that common currency. For a time, it seemed limitless. The state, flush with the spoils of conquest and tribute flowing from distant provinces, expanded its reach across seas and deserts. In doing so, it knitted a vast economic network whose threads all pointed back to the central mint. Yet even at the peak of this hegemony, structural stresses were building. Maintaining distant garrisons and bureaucracies was expensive. The costs of defending far-flung borders rose faster than the revenue drawn from them. Productivity in the core, the farms, workshops, and mines, could not keep pace with the appetite of a sprawling imperial machinery. In response, the state turned to its most powerful lever, the currency itself. Silver content was reduced. Coins were clipped or counterfeited with increasing frequency. At first, the degradations were subtle, a few percentage points of alloy here, a debasement to pay a war there. To many at the center, it seemed a practical compromise. After all, those holding the currency believed it would always be accepted at face value because it always had been. But confidence is fragile. As the quality of the coinage eroded, savvy merchants began to demand higher nominal amounts for the same goods. Wealthy patrons hoarded older, purer coins and circulated the lesser. The velocity of money slowed. Markets grew anxious. The very unit of account that had once underpinned exchange began to lose its role as a reliable measure of value. Debt, too, became a growing burden. As the state expanded its obligations to soldiers, to public works, to elites accustomed to privilege, it borrowed against future resources that were never sufficient to match the promise. Private credit swelled as well, but it too relied on the assumption of stability. When that assumption faltered, contracts were renegotiated, obligations were deferred, and social cohesion frayed. Those once tied together by mutual economic benefit began to see one another as competitors for a shrinking pie. In the provinces, distant from the centers of power, the effects were already visible long before the heartland acknowledged them. Local economies contracted, taxes became onerous, and the very networks that had once flowed toward the capital now diverted elsewhere. Wealth that once circulated freely through the imperial system was increasingly siphoned into pockets of safety, precious goods, land, localized barter networks, rather than through official channels that sustained the state. By the time historians later reckoned the end of that monetary dominance, the collapse had been underway for generations. The shared confidence in a single currency had dissolved not in anger, but in slow attrition, a parable of how even the most widely accepted systems can unravel from within when the incentives that created them eventually work against them. 3 centuries later, on the other side of the Atlantic, another empire believed it had learned the lessons of history. Spain's wealth poured in from the Americas, silver galleons brimming with the New World's bounty. At first it seemed inexhaustible, a constant stream of precious metal that could finance armies, construct palaces, and reward loyal subjects. The crown and its advisors proclaimed repeatedly that this time was different. The abundance of silver, they argued, was permanent, boundless, and a sign of divine favor. Yet beneath the veneer of opulence, the same structural pressures quietly re-emerged. The cost of maintaining far-flung territories outstripped the yield of even the largest treasure fleets. Local industries were neglected as imports of luxury goods flourished, draining capital from domestic productivity. Debt expanded, not as a tool of growth, but to maintain appearances. Interest payments on loans consumed ever larger portions of royal revenue, forcing new taxes on populations already strained. Economists of the time, those we would now call proto-monetary theorists, warned that reliance on silver alone created a fragile illusion of prosperity. Their cautions were ignored. Social consequences became apparent in predictable ways. Urban elites consumed extravagantly, funding monumental architecture and lavish court life, while rural populations bore the brunt of rising taxation. Inflation took hold subtly. Wages lagged, prices climbed, and markets began to signal scarcity even as bullion flowed into the ports. The system's stability was undercut not by invasion, but by overconfidence and the misalignment of incentives. Merchants hoarded coins, soldiers went unpaid at critical moments, and provincial authorities grew adept at diverting resources for local survival rather than central loyalty. Denial permeated every level. Advisors dismissed warnings as alarmist. Kings and ministers trusted that divine favor and sheer size would prevent collapse. Meanwhile, the financial mechanisms that had supported centuries of imperial expansion, credit networks, bullion flows, and administrative oversight became increasingly brittle. Each minor disruption amplified systemic fragility, yet no one perceived the severity until the late stages, when adjustments could no longer compensate. Ultimately, the empire's decline followed the same cadence as earlier systems. Wealth continued to flow through the system, but it failed to reinforce its foundations. Silver galleons still reached the royal coffers, yet by the time they arrived, the social, economic, and political infrastructure could no longer absorb their promise. Productivity lagged behind consumption. Confidence fractured. The perceived permanence of dominance gave way to the inevitability of contraction. And as history demonstrates repeatedly, the belief that this time is different becomes one of the final accelerants in the collapse sequence, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge patterns that have repeated across continents and centuries. Today, the echoes of those past collapses resonate in the structure of the modern global financial system. The dollar, long unchallenged as the primary reserve currency, operates not merely as money, but as the instrument of confidence for trillions of dollars in trade, debt, and savings worldwide. Its dominance rests on the alignment of incentives. Governments, institutions, and private actors all trust that others will continue to accept it, that liquidity will remain abundant, and that global stability hinges on its uninterrupted circulation. Yet structural pressures are quietly reshaping the landscape. Debt levels have expanded to historically unprecedented ratios, both public and private. Productivity growth in many advanced economies struggles to match the pace of consumption and financial commitments. Monetary expansion, once a tool to stabilize crises, now risks eroding long-term faith in the unit of account itself. Incentives that once sustained the system, disciplined fiscal management, confidence in central institutions, and predictable economic outcomes, are increasingly misaligned with immediate political and social pressures. Simultaneously, alternatives to the dollar are emerging, not through sudden revolution, but via gradual adoption. Nations and blocs that once relied exclusively on dollar-based settlements now experiment with other currencies, digital systems, and mechanisms that bypass traditional channels. Each adoption, each diversification, chips away imperceptibly at the centralized confidence that underpins the reserve currency. Unlike political coups or military conquests, these shifts occur quietly, measured in trade flows, swap agreements, and strategic partnerships. Yet their cumulative effect can be profound. Confidence, once assumed, is now conditional. Financial markets, international contracts, and sovereign obligations all rely on shared belief in stability. When that belief falters, even slightly, it initiates feedback loops. Credit tightens, costs of transactions rise, and actors begin to hedge against uncertainty. The mechanisms that once transmitted stability now amplify fragility. And as history has repeatedly shown, systemic failure does not await dramatic headlines. It grows quietly in the margins, becomes visible only when interventions are too late, and unfolds according to structural inevitabilities rather than the intentions of policymakers or the desires of nations. The lesson is consistent. Systems fail not when intentions are flawed, but when incentives break. And today, the world operates inside a framework whose incentives are increasingly misaligned, even as it appears calm on the surface. At the very edge of stability, systems often feel most secure. Late-stage financial structures give the illusion of normalcy precisely because every failure is temporarily masked, every risk normalized. Institutions that once acted as bulwarks now rely on narrative control and procedural inertia to maintain confidence. Warnings are dismissed as alarmist. Analysts, commentators, and even some regulators observe anomalies, but the incentives to act, politically, socially, and economically, are muted until it is too late. In this phase, the mechanisms of denial operate with precision. Central banks signal stability even as balance sheets swell with unconventional assets. Governments proclaim fiscal health while obligations quietly accumulate off the books. Financial instruments, engineered to distribute risk, Instead, concentrate it subtly within the system. Participants grow accustomed to volatility, normalizing it as part of the ongoing rhythm of markets. Confidence, though strained, is maintained not through resilience, but through habituation. The final accelerant is often human, the collective unwillingness to confront inconvenient truths. When outcomes are tied to shared faith, the failure of perception becomes indistinguishable from structural failure itself. By the time stress propagates visibly, the system has lost the flexibility to respond. Capital that could have migrated gradually to safer or more productive allocations has already moved, contracts are already defaulting, and policy tools, once effective, are overwhelmed. What seemed stable in daily observation was, in fact, teetering on the edge, with each additional strain pushing the system closer to a tipping point. History demonstrates that collapse rarely arrives with warning banners. It creeps, accelerates, and, at the last stage, becomes irreversible almost instantly. Those who insist on normalcy in these moments are not deceived by malice, but by the very architecture of incentives that previously sustained them. The calm before the storm is, paradoxically, a feature of late-stage systems, a quiet signal that the next phase, once entered, leaves no room for retreat. Cycles do not end because people are reckless. They end because the structures humans build, markets, states, empires, are governed by incentives that persist long after intentions fade. Wealth flows according to predictable patterns. It accumulates where power is concentrated, dissipates where obligations exceed capacity, and ultimately reforms under new alignments. Each era repeats the same rhythm: expansion, overreach, distortion, strain, compromise, and reconfiguration. The names, technologies, and borders may change, but the forces remain constant. Our present moment, when viewed through this lens, is neither unprecedented nor random. Debt, productivity, monetary expansion, and confidence interact in the same ways they have for millennia. Systems are not moral actors. They are machines of incentives, indifferent to human notions of fairness or foresight. Collapse is not a failure of leadership, but a predictable outcome when structural pressures reach critical thresholds. The past demonstrates that warnings are seldom heeded, that adaptation lags behind stress, and that transformation arrives quietly until it cannot be ignored. If you are watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.